Dust settled without disturbance. It did not fall with urgency, nor did it announce itself with movement. It simply descended, gently, quietly, almost imperceptibly. In that stillness, it became part of the place, part of the story the room no longer felt the need to tell. There was no breeze to scatter it, no footsteps to stir it, and no reason for it to be noticed at all. It rested where it landed, as though that had always been its rightful place. Each fleck is a quiet gesture of time moving forward without asking for acknowledgement. The room it fell into had long since stopped waiting. It didn't strain to remember the voices that once filled it, nor did it mourn the absence of those who had gone. It existed now in that peculiar state where memory fades not because it is forgotten, but because it no longer needs to be remembered. The walls held no resentment for the silence that had taken up residence. In fact, the silence had arrived so slowly, so gradually, that the room barely noticed its coming. It was not the kind of silence that startled or demanded attention. Rather, it was the kind that crept in like twilight, unhurried, inevitable, and soft. The dust gathered in corners where no hands reached. It coated shelves that had once displayed books read too many times to count. Spines cracked in the same places, pages marked not by bookmarks, but by the faint indentation of repeated fingers. It lay across the windowsill, where sunbeams sometimes still wandered in as if they, too, had forgotten why they came. Even light seemed reluctant here, not because the room was dark, but because it had grown shy. Light tiptoed rather than spilled. It entered as though afraid to disrupt what the dust had so patiently arranged. Furniture remained where it had been left, its position no longer serving function, but ritual. A chair faced the window, not because someone sat there, but because someone once had. A table stood beside it, its surface mottled with faint rings where cups had been placed and forgotten again and again. The cup was no longer there, perhaps removed long ago, or perhaps it had never truly existed. But the ring remained. Memory in this room was not an act of recollection, but residue, traces that asked for nothing, not even to be understood. Dust, in its way, was loyal. It kept to its chosen spaces. It did not wander and did not accumulate with haste. It rested lightly but completely, making everything it touched seem both more real and more remote. A book closed decades ago seemed permanently paused. A drawer, half open, looked as though it had stopped mid-thought. A clock on the wall still had hands, but they no longer moved. Their stillness did not seem broken, only resolved. There was no ticking here, no marking of seconds. Time was not measured. It was absorbed. No footsteps echoed through the room. If there had ever been footsteps, they had long since faded beyond the reach of memory. The floor, once perhaps polished to a modest shine, had dulled with dignity. It no longer creaked in protest, nor groaned with age. Instead, it waited. Not for something, but for nothing at all. It simply waited because that was what it had learned to do. The grain of the wood had softened under time's quiet pressure, not worn down but gentled. There was a curtain, of course. Most rooms have one. It hung not as decoration, nor as defense against light, but as a witness. Its folds had memorized their own shape. They no longer moved even when the window was open. They had forgotten the wind, or perhaps the wind had forgotten them. A faint line of dust along their hem marked where they met the floor. A subtle conversation held entirely in stillness. And still, they hung. Not limp, but serene. They had nothing more to reveal and nothing more to conceal. Once, perhaps, someone had entered this room with purpose, with a book, or a letter, or an afternoon to spare. Once, perhaps, someone had looked around and thought of the future, not in grand terms, not in declarations, but in the small, ordinary way that people think. I will clean this tomorrow. I will open that drawer later. I will return. But tomorrow had become another kind of dust. and the drawer stayed half open. The return never occurred, or if it did, it went unnoticed, so brief or so silent that the room forgot it immediately. The air in this space was not stale exactly. It had simply stopped participating in the world beyond. It no longer smelled of outside, no soil, no rain, no wood smoke. Its scent was neutral, absent, like a pause that had been held too long. If you stood in this room, you might feel you had stepped into a breath someone had meant to release but never did. The weight of it wasn't heavy, just full of all the things that no longer needed saying. And in this fullness, dust continued to fall, not aggressively, not insistently, just with quiet repetition, like snowfall with no chill, like the slow closing of a book whose story has ended but whose cover stays open, just in case. The dust did not seek out symbols. It had no agenda, no metaphor. It existed, which was enough. That was its truth. Not every presence must be purposeful. Some are simply persistent. The ceiling overhead bore its own signs of stillness, faint cracks like hairlines, not from trauma but from rest. As if the structure had exhaled and chosen not to inhale again. The paint flaked in one corner, curling gently like a page turned halfway. Not urgent, not neglected. Just paused. Everything here was paused. Not because someone pressed a button, but because movement had been allowed to cease. It had not been interrupted. It had simply concluded. Outside this room, the world likely continued, but it felt as though it did so at a distance. As though it respected the silence inside, it did not knock or shout or ask to come in. If voices carried through the walls, they arrived muffled, reverent, and unsure if they were welcome. Nothing here was forbidding, but nothing invited either. The room did not reach out, it only received. Even insects, those tireless tenants of forgotten spaces, seemed to keep their distance. No webs crossed the corners, and no trails meandered along baseboards. If anything lived here, it did so invisibly. Perhaps even the room itself was alive, not in the way that humans measure life, but in the way that spaces sometimes become sentient through solitude. As if by being left alone long enough, a place learns how to exist without being used. It stops waiting to be occupied and simply becomes itself. The shadows in this room did not lurk. They softened. They folded gently into one another, overlapping like well-worn fabric. They did not lengthen or shrink with the sun's angle. They merely accompanied the space, content to be neither light nor dark, but something in between, a kind of visual sigh. If you watched long enough, you might forget whether you were looking at a shadow or a memory. The two here were nearly the same. There was, of course, no sound. Not truly. Perhaps the distant creak of a beam adjusting, or the faint whisper of dust displacing itself. But no music, no words. And yet the silence had tone, a resonance. If you listened too long, you might begin to hear what wasn't there. The ghost of laughter, the hush of a page turning, the breath between thoughts. Nothing concrete, just echoes of what might have once belonged here. The door to the room remained closed, not locked. There was no barrier to entry, only a quiet disinterest in being entered. The handle bore no fingerprints. The threshold was clean in a way that suggested no one had crossed it in some time. But the door didn't mind. Doors, like dust, understand patience. They do not ask to be opened. They wait, or they forget, or they become part of the wall entirely, and the dust settled. Always the dust settled. Its weight was not a burden. It asked for no attention. It recorded nothing intentionally, but still, it told stories. Stories not of what happened, but of what didn't. Not of presence, but of absence. And not of loss either, just of continuation, quiet and uneventful, like a thought never fully formed. This was not a haunted place. Nothing tragic had occurred here. There were no echoes of violence, no heartbreak etched into the floorboards. What lingered was not grief, but gentleness. The room had been lived in once, warmly, maybe even joyfully. But that was long ago, and joy, like everything else here, had learned how to lie still. In the end, there was no end. The dust would continue to fall, slowly, softly, without need for audience or explanation. It would layer itself upon what already was, making the old slightly older and the quiet slightly quieter. And the room would allow it, would welcome it even. Because here, in this stillness, in this place untouched by urgency, dust settled without disturbance. And that was enough. The room had not changed in years. Not really. Dust may have gathered, and light may have shifted its angles across the surfaces, but the room itself remained steady, as though it had been waiting for something to return, or someone. The walls, tall and quiet, did not lean or crack. They stood as they always had, patient, observant, and somehow withholding. They had seen more than they ever spoke of. They had felt the gentle hush of solitude settle into the corners like mist, folding itself into the space between one heartbeat and the next. And in all that time, they held their breath. Not literally, of course, but in the way old places seem to pause, as if reluctant to disturb the moment, the memory, or the person who dares to step inside. The walls did not echo, nor did they creak. Their silence was intentional. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't born of emptiness, but of preservation, of a memory wrapped carefully in stillness. The very air carried the weight of this choice. It was not oppressive, but contemplative, like the kind of silence that hangs over a field of snow. It was a breath drawn in, but never quite released. When someone entered the room, they always noticed it, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere, as if stepping inside a place that was in the middle of remembering something. A pause between thoughts, a held breath. The air wasn't stale, but it had a texture, a softness that clung to the skin like old velvet. It was as though the walls remembered what was said here, what was unsaid, and most of all, what had been left unfinished. But they did not judge. They simply waited. The furniture, too, knew its role. It did not move nor call attention to itself. It waited in quiet companionship with the walls, content in stillness. A chair by the window, its fabric gently faded by decades of sun. A bookshelf that had not been rearranged in years, perhaps out of respect. Each object within the room had its own sense of pause, as though aware that movement might interrupt the unspoken agreement the room had made with time. They honored the silence as one might honor an old friend, without needing to ask why. The floorboards beneath whispered, but only when they needed to. They did not groan beneath heavy steps or complain when someone shifted their weight. They exhaled softly, like someone stretching after a long nap. Their creaks were not protests, but acknowledgments, gentle reminders that they were still here, still watching. They, too, had learned to hold their breath in tandem with the walls, sinking their stillness like dancers waiting for the next measure of music that never came. And what of the windows? They looked out without expectation. Dust clung to the glass not out of neglect, but because no one had the heart to disturb it. The smudges from a hand long ago still remained near the edge, faint but present, as if someone had leaned there once, meaning to say something, and then didn't. The light that filtered in did so with care, never too bright, never too abrupt. It joined the breath-holding ceremony, its beams stretching gently across the floor without disturbing the room's quiet agreement with itself. There were no clocks in this room. Time was not welcome here, not in the usual way. It was not measured by ticking seconds or chimes. Instead, time in this room moved like sediment settling in water, slow, soft, and invisible unless you truly looked. It moved by how the light shifted from one wall to the next, by how the warmth changed when the clouds passed, by how long it took for a shadow to inch across the old rug. The kind of time that wasn't counted, only felt. There may have once been voices in this room. Laughter, perhaps. The kind that fills a space and leaves a warmth behind. Or tears, quiet and dignified, sinking into the cushions without ever needing to be explained. Words of comfort, words of confusion, or no words at all. Just presence. The walls had absorbed all of it. They did not forget, nor did they replay it aloud. They simply held it all, like a locket tucked beneath layers of fabric, worn close but never opened again. This was how they remembered, not in sound, but in breathless stillness. The ceiling, too, had its own way of waiting. Cracked in places, yes, but not broken. Faded, but not forgotten. It hovered above like a sky that had once seen stars painted on it, or perhaps a chandelier that used to cast shapes in the evening. Now, it simply watched from above, protective and quiet, like a hand held gently above a candle's flame. It kept the silence contained, not stifled. It allowed it to bloom in downward spirals, surrounding everything below like a blanket of pause. The corners of the room had the deepest silence, not darker, not colder, but quieter. It was as if the breath held by the walls gathered in the corners, pooling there like water in the bends of a stream. That's where the most delicate memories rested, unspoken ones, never quite voiced, only felt. There might have been footsteps once, heading toward those corners and stopping short, or eyes that lingered there, waiting for something that never came. The corners did not demand attention. They were simply there, holding their part of the room's breath. If you sat in this room long enough, you would start to feel it. Not the silence itself, but the way the silence waited. It wasn't impatient. It wasn't sad. It simply was. It stayed close but didn't crowd you. It let you think without interruption, or let you forget that you were thinking at all. It invited you to rest, to wonder, or to say nothing. It didn't expect a story or an answer, only a presence. The walls did not need to be filled with sound to feel full. They already were. Occasionally, a breeze might wander in through a forgotten gap in the window. It didn't break the stillness. It joined it. The curtains, if they moved at all, did so like a sigh that didn't want to be heard. The breeze brought no news, no urgency. It was just passing through, nodding politely at the room's hush before moving on. The dust would shimmer for a moment in its wake, like memories stirred but not disturbed. Then it would settle again, and the breath would remain held. There was nothing haunted here. No ghosts, only impressions, soft and non-intrusive, like the scent of old paper or the outline of a cup that once sat too long in the same spot. Everything was gently remembered, never forced. It was a room that did not demand your attention, but received it all the same. It didn't ask you to stay, yet you found yourself lingering. Because the quiet here wasn't lonely, it was companionable. The kind that held space for you without asking anything in return. Even if someone spoke aloud in the room, the walls didn't echo. They listened, but they didn't respond. Words would be received, acknowledged, and then folded into the stillness like a page tucked into a drawer. There was a reverence to it, the way the room absorbed sound without erasing it, as if promising, "What you say here can remain here." Quietly kept. That's why the breath stayed held. It was part of the promise. A vow of silence, not out of secrecy, but respect. Perhaps that is what the breath truly was, a kind of vow. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling, they had all agreed to hold space without interruption, to keep the room from rushing ahead, to allow every moment, even the forgotten ones, to remain whole. They did not exhale because the moment to do so had not yet arrived, or maybe because they didn't want to disturb what had settled there, memories, hopes, and sorrows too delicate to name. And so, they continued holding it, day after day, season after season, even as the world outside moved forward, changed colors, and grew loud with new things. The room stayed exactly as it was, nestled in the breath between then and now, a quiet museum of the unspoken, a resting place for what was left behind. The walls did not rush, they did not reach. They simply stood still and present. In their stillness, they made space for everything else to soften. And perhaps if you stayed long enough, you might notice your own breath beginning to match theirs. Slower, quieter, more deliberate. You might find yourself breathing less to speak and more to feel, less to explain and more to simply exist. And in that breath held between exhale and inhale, you might finally understand what the walls had always known. That there is a power in stillness, a memory in silence, and a presence in the spaces we often overlook. Even now, the walls do not move. They do not release their breath, because the room is still listening, still honoring, still keeping the moment whole. The table still pointed north. That was the first thing anyone noticed, if they noticed anything at all. Not that many did. Most walked past it without a second thought, seeing only an old table in a room with too little light. But for those who stayed long enough to truly see it, there was something quietly insistent about the way it remained. Not grandly, not dramatically, just there. Positioned in the same direction it had always pointed, as though the room had once revolved around it and never quite stopped doing so. It was not a compass table. It didn't spin and didn't click with magnetized certainty. There were no engravings or ornate directional markers to explain its orientation. No mystical carvings, no hidden purpose that leapt into understanding. It simply sat, in quiet obedience to a direction someone had once decided mattered. And ever since, it had held to that. North. Whatever north meant to whoever had placed it there in the first place. The table was unremarkable in its materials. 4 legs, slightly uneven, a surface scratched more by time than by any incident. Corners worn into softened curves by generations of casual contact. A stack of faded paper still lived in one corner, not refreshed in years, but never removed. A dent in one of the planks bore the imprint of something that must have fallen there with a bit of weight. An ink bottle, maybe, long dried. And still, despite everything, it pointed north. There had once been a chair pulled up beside it, though it had long since been taken to another room. The patch of floor beneath it had retained the imprint of that chair's feet. Not in dirt, exactly, but in memory. The scuff pattern, the subtle wear, the slight dip in the grain. As if the floor itself remembered being sat upon. As if the table, too, remembered being used. No one had written at the table for some time, but the air around it still carried the vague scent of ink, paper, and wooden drawers that once held things now lost. The drawer didn't open anymore. It had swollen shut one rainy season and never quite shrank back. Whatever was inside had become part of the table's interior life, unseen but somehow present, quiet but not gone, and always it pointed north. There was something gentle in the stubbornness of its orientation. It did not resist being moved, though no one tried, but it didn't ask for attention either. It simply held its place, its direction, and its role. Perhaps someone long ago had turned it to catch a certain kind of light during a certain hour of the day. Or perhaps it had once been arranged that way for practical reasons, a better view of the door, or alignment with a stove's warmth. Or maybe it was symbolic, a desk for charting travels and a table where decisions were made, letters written, and maps drawn. And once set, no one had the heart or the reason to change it. The table had become part of the house's rhythm, part of the quiet architecture of memory. Dust came and settled, then settled again. The seasons changed. The windows opened less frequently. Curtains began to yellow at the edges. But the table remained aligned, its top edge parallel to something larger than the room, to something older than the house, to something perhaps that could not be seen, but was still deeply felt. A spider had claimed the underside as its own, its web a careful geometry of patience and precision. There were no flies caught in it, no signs of hunger or struggle, just the web, suspended like a thought that had waited too long to be said aloud. Even the spider, it seemed, had grown old in peace. In the late afternoon, light would sometimes pass through the west-facing window and land in a quiet line across the table, S-grain. Not often, only when the clouds allowed it. But when it did, the light did not scatter or wander, it settled with calm intent. It found the northern edge and seemed to trace it gently, as if confirming something that had never needed proof. A line of light, aligning itself with something constant. It didn't last. The light faded as gently as it had arrived, but for those few minutes the table seemed to glow from within, as if it remembered what it had once been used for. Sometimes people said the table had once belonged to a cartographer. Others insisted it had been a clerk's desk, someone whose job had been routine, silent, and unending. Still others believed it had simply always been there, even before the walls around it, that the house was built to accommodate the table, not the other way around. Whatever the truth, the table did not reveal it. It didn't protest, nor confirm, nor correct. It had no urgency, no message. It was content to exist within the slow turning of time, a constant in a room that had long since stopped expecting anything. Children once played near it, though not on it. They seemed to understand instinctively that it was not a place for games. They would build towers with blocks nearby and chase shadows around the legs, but the tabletop remained untouched, sacred in some quiet, informal way. When they grew older, they left the room behind, leaving only echoes of their laughter in the corners. Once, someone had left a candle burning on the far end. The wax had dripped over the side and hardened into a curve that resembled the arc of a crescent moon. No one had ever scraped it away. It had simply become part of the table's surface story. A pale scar of light made solid. If one sat at the correct angle, it could still catch a little glow from the sunset and appear briefly alive. Even the dust, it seemed, settled in a way that respected the direction. There were no thick coats of negligence. Only a soft film, the kind that feels more like time itself resting than actual dirt. A slow accumulation of air and memory. A texture that said, nothing happened here quickly, and nothing needed to. There had once been a plant beside it. A simple one, ivy, perhaps, or something with thin, trailing stems. It had grown toward the table's edge and then stopped, curling just at the corner, as though it, too, understood the boundary. When it withered, no one replaced it. But its dried leaves were left in a bowl, brittle and curled inward like closed hands. They made no sound when touched, just the slightest whisper of having once been green. If anyone ever sat there again, they would have felt it, the gentle pull of alignment. Not physical, but atmospheric. The sensation that things were where they belonged, not because someone insisted on it, but because they had been given the time to become so. A deep kind of stillness. Not the stillness of abandonment or emptiness, but the stillness of something long settled, like silt at the bottom of a clear pond. Sometimes a breeze would pass through the room, lifting the edge of the old papers ever so slightly. Not enough to turn a page, just enough to remind one that the air still moved, that the world beyond still rotated, and that north still existed even when unspoken. The paper would rise and fall like a sigh, like a breath remembered from a long sleep. The table never creaked, not like the floorboards or the stairs. Its joints were so well worn, so accustomed to their own weight, that they had no need to protest. It didn't groan beneath memory, didn't sag beneath silence. It simply held. It was a kind of quiet posture, a practice of presence that asked for nothing in return. Sometimes, during especially quiet afternoons, when the light fell in long diagonal lines and the air held the hush of almost rain, The table seemed to hum, not with sound, but with something subtler, a vibration of being, the sense that it had known stories, had held elbows and wrists and intentions, and had once been trusted with secrets written in longhand, that it had witnessed enough to become more than furniture, and yet asked for no recognition. It still pointed north. Even now, with no maps upon it, no hand guiding quill across parchment, and no lantern burning late into the night, the table knew its place. Not in the hierarchy of things, not in the catalog of belongings, but in the geography of memory. Its direction was not instruction, it was presence, an orientation not of duty, but of quiet resolve. And so it remained, not forgotten exactly, not used either, simply there, a table that still pointed north and had no need to point anywhere else. The light shifted, but time didn't move. It was not the sort of change that demanded attention, nor one that brought with it any sense of urgency. It happened slowly, like the soft bend of a blade of grass in a wind that didn't quite arrive. At first, the light touched only the edge of the window pane, a barely there shimmer that found its way across the sill and quietly began its daily drift across the floor. The room, long accustomed to this dance of angles and fading color, did not resist. It yielded softly, as though agreeing to the passage of something that wasn't quite time, but something near enough to feel like it. No clocks ticked in this room, not loudly at least. If there was a mechanism somewhere that marked seconds or hours, it had long since dulled its voice into the hush of background memory. There was only the light, and the way it traced the same path it had traced the day before, and the one before that. A gold-toned echo of the sun's rotation, yes, but also a quiet habit of the room itself. The floor remembered. The chair near the corner remembered. Even the wallpaper, faded in vertical streaks where sun met surface day after day, held on to this gentle repetition as though it were a ritual too sacred to interrupt. But time did not move, not in the way that mattered. People often measure time by what changes, by what breaks or decays or blooms, by clocks, calendars, wrinkles, deadlines. Here, none of those tools worked. The air held still. The dust hung not from neglect, but from settled intention. It was as if time had gently taken off its coat, placed it over the back of the nearest chair, and said, "Just a moment," only to forget it had ever meant to leave. The person who once sat in the room, whether yesterday or a decade ago, had left no strong imprint, but a subtle one. The light still fell across the same place where a lap had once held an open book. The arm of the chair still bore the faint depression of a hand that rested there regularly, like punctuation. The table nearby had no clutter, but a single mug remained, long empty, the stain inside a quiet testament not to use, but to presence. Outside, the world no doubt kept moving. People were born, people left. Seasons changed their costume of leaves and sky. But inside this room, the rhythm was slower. The light moved in arcs that remembered only the sun, and not the events the sun illuminated. The movement of light was not progress, but a turn. It was not a record of moments gone by, but a repetition that blurred the line between yesterday and forever. At certain times, the light would hit the mirror, just so. And in that mirror, a sliver of brightness would stretch like a question across the ceiling. Not a loud question, not one that demanded an answer, just wondering. Just a curve of light that appeared and faded in the span of a breath. And then nothing. The mirror, like everything else in the room, was not meant to reflect the present. It held only the memory of things that didn't insist on being remembered. It was easy, in such a room, to imagine that time had taken on a new shape. Not a line, not a circle, but a soft stillness that spread outward in every direction. As if the past were not behind, but folded inside. As if the future were not forward, but waiting quietly beside the door, not knocking, just resting its back against the frame. The now, in such a space, was not something rushing by. It was something held, like breath, not trapped, but suspended, safe, quiet, and whole. The light shifted again, a subtle darkening along the edges of the furniture. The color in the room turned softer, not dimmer, not yet, just more subdued, as though preparing itself for the thought of evening, though not quite ready to say the day was done. Outside, birds may have been calling out the end of their skybound hours, but here the only sound was the soft sigh of old wood expanding, contracting, remembering. Somewhere in the house, a clock may have chimed once, faintly, but even that seemed too sharp for this room. Here, sound did not travel fast. It arrived, hesitated, and softened itself before touching anything. Voices, if they had ever spoken here, did not echo. They lingered like breath on glass, present for a moment, then gone without residue. The light continued its path, though time did not answer the call. Some objects might have once measured time. A calendar on the far wall with a date circled in pencil, a small antique watch resting on a bookshelf, a folded letter that bore the imprint of a year no longer felt. But these two, had surrendered their duty. They existed now not to track the passage of moments, but to become part of the stillness. Their significance had been gently let go, like a page turned not to reach the end, but simply to see what image might be on the next one. The person, if there ever was one, must have known this. Or if they didn't know it consciously, they had allowed themselves to fall into it. Not sleep exactly, not withdrawal, but a softness that blurred the need to move forward. They had learned to live where time didn't insist. They had sat, perhaps, in that chair for hours or minutes that never asked to be counted. The room had welcomed this. It had made space for them the way an old quilt makes space for a familiar shape. Even the shadows did not rush. They lengthened with patience, not with urgency. The slant of the sun now passed across the bookshelf, touching the spines of titles rarely opened and less frequently read. These books did not mind. They were content to be unread so long as they were present. Their purpose had shifted from being consumed to simply being there. The same could be said for everything in the room. The air grew cooler, just slightly. Enough to suggest that a window somewhere might have been cracked open earlier and forgotten. But even this breeze, too, understood the rhythm of the place. It did not flutter the curtains. It did not rearrange the dust. It simply passed through like someone who remembered being here once and had only come back to make sure nothing had changed too much. And nothing had, not really. The light had shifted, but time hadn't moved. Or if it had done so in such a gentle, circular way that no one could point to a beginning or an end. It was a time not of clocks, but of presence. Not of deadlines, but of echoes. The kind of time that asks nothing of you but to notice, to rest, to breathe and be breathed alongside the room. Perhaps that's what this room was made for, not living in the conventional sense, but remembering how to be still, how to sit without needing to explain, how to watch the light move across the floor and not ask where it was going, how to feel the weight of silence not as absence, but as companionship. The light now brushed the edge of the rug, the same place it always reached just before dusk. It was not a dramatic sunset, nor a golden hour meant for pictures. It was quieter than that, a light that bowed out slowly, respectfully. A kind of closing that didn't mean the story had ended, only that this page, this moment, had said enough. And so it continued. The room waited. The light dimmed. The floor held the warmth a little longer before letting go. And time, kind as it was here, remained still. Or perhaps it simply moved in such a way that no one needed to notice. That was enough. That was all it had to be. The light shifted, and time didn't mind. There are rooms that do not expect company anymore. Rooms where chairs remain pulled out just slightly, as if someone had meant to return but never did. Where curtains hang still in closed windows, and the dust, thick yet weightless, settles like time itself learning to rest. In such places, silence is not merely a lack of sound, but a presence in its own right. It moves with the light across the floor, changes tone with the time of day, and waits with a kind of patient certainty. Silence was the only visitor, does not speak of abandonment as something mournful, nor does it treat solitude like a punishment. Instead, it gestures softly to the idea that not all spaces long to be filled. Some are content to echo only with memory. Silence arrived here long ago and made itself comfortable. It did not knock or ask permission. It entered the room the way mist enters a valley, slowly, gently, all at once. At first, perhaps, it was met with resistance, the ticking of a clock, a kettle left to boil too long, footsteps returning in the hope that something had changed. But gradually, those small interruptions faded. The clock wound down. The kettle was never filled again. The footsteps grew hesitant, then stopped altogether. And silence, unhurried and unapologetic, took up residence. It didn't come with demands. It didn't rearrange furniture or open doors. It simply settled into the air, folding itself into corners, curling along the baseboards, and breathing between the pages of books no longer read. Silence here is not empty. It is layered, woven through with the impressions of voices that once existed, footsteps that once crossed the floor, and gestures that were once repeated without thought. It is the sound of habit after habit that has faded. It is the ghost of routine, the residue of intention. One might think such a room would feel cold, but that's not quite true. Silence, left long enough, generates a kind of warmth. Not heat exactly, but a soft hum of familiarity. The quiet becomes companionable. It has its own rhythm and its own temperature. The floorboards don't protest anymore. They no longer groan for attention. They yield instead gently to the weight of air alone. And the light, when it filters through the blinds, doesn't rush to illuminate. It pauses, too. It lingers. Somewhere along the way, time forgot to keep count here. The minutes do not string themselves into hours, nor do the days distinguish themselves from one another. Without interruption, time becomes circular. Mornings and evenings blur into a steady twilight. Objects remain as they were. A book on the table. A cup, still holding the faint ring of its last use. The soft pattern of wear on the rug that no longer deepens. This stillness does not ache. It simply persists. The silence has learned every shape of the room. It knows the outline of the windows, the faded crack near the base of the west-facing wall, and the once-loved stain on the chair's arm. It wraps itself around these imperfections with tenderness. It does not seek to erase them. It only holds them. There is no judgment in the silence, only acknowledgement. It observes without needing to change and listens without the urge to reply. Its presence allows everything else to simply be. For a while, there may have been a voice, one that spoke aloud, even if only to hear something in return. Perhaps it was a name. Perhaps it was a line from a story half remembered. But even those small sounds eventually dissolved into the larger hush. There is something in this kind of silence that absorbs not only noise, but also expectation. Over time, the desire for reply diminishes, and what remains is a calm acceptance. That silence is not a waiting room, but the guest who stays. Sometimes the silence wears different clothes. In the morning, it may arrive in the form of soft light through a dusty window pane. At noon, it takes the shape of unmoving shadows across the floor. And at night, it deepens, thickens, even, as if the walls themselves are breathing it in. It is not the same silence throughout the day. But it is always silence. Just like grief changes shape over time, or love grows quieter without growing less, so too does silence shift while remaining whole. There is no need to fill this room with noise. That would be a kind of cruelty, a disruption to what has taken years to learn how to rest. The silence is not a void to be corrected. It is a conclusion that does not need revision. It holds space the way a hand might hold another, not to possess, but to comfort. The silence is not alone. It is the company, the kind that does not knock but always arrives on time, the kind that understands the meaning of sitting quietly together without needing to speak. Outside, the world still moves. Trees sway, people talk, and horns blare. Letters arrive and are not opened. Calendars mark time that is no longer tracked. But none of that rush disturbs the inside. The silence within these walls has created a boundary that outside noise cannot cross. Not because it is strong, but because it is complete. There is nothing left to enter. Everything that needs to be said has already been felt. Everything that could be done has already settled into the seams of the floor and the fibers of the curtains. There is a strange kind of memory that silence keeps. Not the vivid cinematic kind, not even the painful or cherished kind, but the quiet memory of movement, of presence, of rituals that once felt like nothing and now echo like everything. Silence remembers the way someone stood at the window each evening, the way a drawer was always opened, even when nothing was needed, the way breath filled a room after a long sigh. It does not replay these moments, but it carries them. Softly, faithfully. In many ways, silence is the most loyal witness. It stays when others leave. It endures when everything else fades. It watches not because it must, but because it can. Because it knows that even absence deserves a witness. Even forgetting should be remembered by something. Even when all the photographs have yellowed and all the letters are unreadable, silence still holds the shape of each sentence once spoken in love or in loss. There may be those who peer into such a room and find it lifeless. They will see stillness and mistake it for emptiness. They will glance and turn away, uncomfortable with what does not declare its purpose. But those who know, those who have lived long enough to understand the gravity of hush, will recognize the grace in this place. The hush is not vacant. It is sacred. And the silence is not the absence of someone. It is the continuation of what they left behind. The air here is thick not with dust alone, but with something denser, like the residue of time folding in on itself. There are no loud conclusions here, no great endings. Only the prolonged, delicate continuation of a moment that never insisted on being more than it was. Silence does not conclude. It endures. And in doing so, it holds open the door for meaning to breathe, quietly, unhurried. The chair remains in place. The curtain still gathers light. The walls hold the warmth of 1,000 quiet mornings. And the silence, unmoving, unbothered, undisturbed, remains the only visitor. But it is enough, more than enough, because it does not ask questions. It does not fidget or demand answers. It simply remains. And in remaining, it says, this was a place that mattered. Not loudly, not urgently, but in the way a lullaby matters long after the child is grown. In the way a final word, softly spoken, still echoes years later. We often imagine endings as final things. Doors closing, lights dimming, people leaving. But some endings are neither sudden nor dramatic. Some are slow fade-outs, like the quieting of a room after conversation, or the settling of a house as night arrives. Silence was the only visitor is that kind of ending. Not an erasure, but a soft punctuation, a gentle way of saying that something once was, and though it may no longer be, it continues in the hush that followed. And maybe that's enough. Not all things need a legacy that shouts. Not all rooms need to be re-entered. Some are meant to hold silence the way others hold stories. And silence in its way becomes a story too. A final chapter not written in ink, but in pause, in stillness, in breath. It does not explain. It does not apologize. It simply offers a seat and asks nothing more of you than to listen, not with ears, but with presence. Just for a moment, just until the room folds back into quiet again. And when you leave, not if, but when, you carry a part of that silence with you. Not as a weight, but as a companion. A reminder that not all presence is loud. That sometimes what stays behind is not what was said or done, but what was quietly allowed to be. And so, silence remains. Not because there is nothing left, but because what remains no longer needs to speak. The drawer was left ajar. Not open in invitation, not pried in panic, just slightly, very slightly, shifted from its closed state. It had not been yanked or slammed or even firmly pulled. Rather, it seemed to have drifted that way over time, as if the wood had slowly relaxed, exhaled, and come to rest there, half shut, half exposed. There was no drama in its position. It was not a cry for help or a gesture of meaning. It was simply ajar. And that small, almost imperceptible gap felt as old as the drawer itself. The air inside the drawer had grown still, undisturbed for so long that it seemed to hum with quiet purpose. Not the kind of purpose you could name, but one that felt known anyway. Dust had settled there too, in fine layers that made the contents feel swaddled, tucked into time itself. There was nothing extraordinary inside, just the remnants of things once touched often, now left to rest. A string with no purpose, a stub of a pencil too short to use, but not discarded. Paper clips that had lost their spring, scraps of yellowing paper with handwriting that had faded into soft gray, curling at the edges, and that gap, the slight open edge, seemed to breathe. Not loudly, not like wind or whisper, but in the way a sleeping house breathes at night. Slowly, with long pauses, as if the drawer still remembered what it meant to be reached for, to be chosen, to be opened in rhythm with the day. There had been a time, long ago, when someone reached for it daily, perhaps every morning, perhaps every time they passed the desk. Fingers that knew exactly where the drawer stuck and exactly how to angle the wrist to ease it open. Those same fingers likely knew the way the wood swelled in summer and shrank in winter. They would have recognized the faint scrape of the runners and the soft thud it made when it shut with a little more force than necessary. But that hand no longer came. And so the drawer remained as it was, neither forgotten nor remembered, simply paused. No longer part of a routine, no longer closed, no longer opened, just ajar. Its liminality made it oddly sacred, like a breath caught in the chest, like a thought not quite spoken aloud. It made the whole desk feel as though it, too, were waiting, not for someone, not for something, but for the right kind of silence to finish settling in. Above the drawer, the desktop was calm, flat, and faintly mottled with the patina of use. A water ring here, a scratch there, and small dents that had softened over time. At some point, someone had written letters here, or done sums in careful ink, or drawn small, idle shapes in the margins of a page. There had been a time when papers were spread out, when the drawer was opened with quick, practiced ease to grab whatever was needed next. Rubber bands, a key, a dried-up pen that only worked again after being shaken just so. These gestures once defined the room, once gave it life, but now the drawer sat with that gap, a quiet openness that didn't ask, didn't explain, and didn't resist. The handle, too, bore the history of touch. Brass, once shiny, had dulled to a soft, even tone. Not from neglect, but from years of fingers rubbing it without notice. The kind of wear that comes from presence, not absence. And now, that same handle caught the light only rarely, only when the sun managed to slant through the window at just the right time of day. And even then, the reflection wasn't bright or proud. It was drowsy, gentle, a nod rather than a wave. What lay beyond the drawer, in the depths of the desk, was irrelevant now. This moment was about the drawer's half-open truth. A drawer left fully open would have been a statement. A drawer slammed shut might have meant finality. But this was a drawer that ended in a comma, a drawer that paused mid-thought. It offered neither conclusion nor beginning, only a stillness that had settled so deeply it no longer noticed itself. Perhaps long ago someone had reached for it and been interrupted. A knock at the door, a voice calling from another room, a kettle whistling on a forgotten stove. They meant to return. They always did. But life moved forward with that quiet, relentless ease it has, not with drama, but with routine. And the drawer, left ajar, remained a footnote, a detail so small it escaped notice. Time gathered around it like mist. Even the dust along the edge of the drawer had its own kind of hush. It had not yet bridged the gap. The tiniest line of clean wood showed where the drawer had shifted, a faint sliver of untouched space. It was this line, more than anything, that whispered of time's passing. The edge that hadn't gathered dust, the crack that let in the faintest light. It suggested motion, not recent, but remembered. It hinted at the last time, at the final gesture, that almost unnoticed act of beginning to close something but not quite finishing the task. What was left inside would never be reorganized again. It didn't need to be. There was a strange peace in that, in knowing that nothing more would be added, nothing more removed, that the drawer, in its current state, had achieved something like completion. Not perfection, not resolution, just quiet. A settledness. Its contents didn't miss being used. Objects don't remember purpose like people do. They simply exist. And if left untouched long enough, they begin to belong to the space instead of to the person who once put them there. Occasionally, when the light hit just right, the shadow of the drawer stretched out over the floor like a soft gesture. It looked a little like reaching, a little like retreat. And perhaps it was both. The shadow did not stay long. Like everything else in the room, it did not insist on itself. But for that brief time, it reminded the space of the slow and patient ways that objects remember. Not with narrative, not with emotion, but with placement, with posture, with pause. The desk that held the drawer was not elaborate. It had no carvings, no embellishment. It did not aspire to grandeur. It had been built to serve, to endure, to be sturdy enough for repetition. It had survived years of use and even more years of stillness. Its wood was the color of sleep, of dry leaves, of rooms where people whisper. It did not complain when the drawer stopped being opened. It simply accepted the change in rhythm and the absence of movement and held the drawer exactly where it had been left. In many ways, the drawer felt like a metaphor for the room itself, a space that had once been full of action, now suspended in a kind of timeless pause. Not abandoned, not sealed, just paused. Like a sentence waiting for someone to pick up the pen again, but no one came. And after a while, the drawer no longer waited to be closed. It simply became the way it was, slightly ajar, slightly open, slightly unfinished. If a person were to enter the room now, if they walked quietly enough, slowly enough, they might not notice the drawer at first. It would not announce itself. It would not creak. But if they stood long enough, if they allowed their eyes to soften, they would see it. That small tilt, that subtle misalignment, that breath of openness. And they might feel something stir. Not memory, necessarily, but recognition. The kind that comes when you find something exactly where it was left, long after you forgot you left it. There's comfort in that kind of constancy, in the idea that something stayed, even when everything else moved on. That the drawer, half open, had remained untouched by the urgency of the world outside. That it had continued its slow, silent existence without asking for anything more than space and time. And so it remained, Not hidden, not displayed, but gently exposed. A reminder that not everything needs to be finished, and not everything needs to be explained. That sometimes a drawer left ajar is enough. Enough to hold what it holds. Enough to say what it says. Enough to remain exactly where it is. There are some places that are kept closed not by key or chain, but by something far less tangible. Something like agreement or silence, or the mere weight of time. These are not locks forged of metal or enforced by law. They are the kinds of barriers that drift into being slowly, like dust accumulating over decades, until no one quite remembers when the door was last opened or why it remained shut. No lock had truly barred entry is the kind of phrase that carries with it a quiet resistance, a knowing stillness. It suggests that the door was never really locked at all, only treated as though it was. Perhaps there had once been a real lock, a simple latch, perhaps, a rusting hinge. But long after the mechanics of entry had decayed or disappeared, the habit of not entering remained. The idea of a boundary had replaced the boundary itself. People had learned not to try, and over time, forgetting took the place of warning. The door did not glare or threaten. It merely existed, closed, undisturbed. And because no one dared or bothered to test the handle, it did not need to be locked. That is how memory sometimes works, not with dramatic gestures, but with slow, quiet omission. A hallway is passed over for years until no one can recall what's kept at its end. A drawer goes unopened, a journal is left unread, a key is not lost, only left behind in a dish that no one checks anymore. The world turns, and the spaces untouched begin to feel sacred, not because they are, but because they simply are not interrupted. No lock had truly barred entry, and yet the room beyond remained untouched. One might imagine that inside there was nothing remarkable. A low table with a missing leg, a chair softened at the edges with age. Perhaps a window that filtered the light so gently it seemed the dust in the air had frozen mid-fall. There would be no grandeur, no secrets waiting to be uncovered. Just the quiet residue of something that once mattered. Something once daily, now merely dormant. Why do we let certain places sleep while others bustle endlessly? Why are some drawers full of things we touch and shuffle and reorganize, while others remain as they were since the last hand closed them? There's no real reason most times. Just a rhythm. Just a feeling. Sometimes the space itself seems to resist presence, as if it had learned to live alone. Or perhaps it simply waits, not for someone specific, but for the kind of person who won't be in a hurry when they enter. You could have opened that door if you wished. The handle still turned. The hinges still moved, albeit with a low, sighing groan, like a memory stirred from deep sleep. The floor on the other side would not have collapsed. The air would not have choked you. There would have been no consequences. And yet, most people wouldn't have tried. It's strange, isn't it? How something so accessible can feel so impossibly remote. Perhaps the first person who chose not to enter had a reason, a grief they didn't want to awaken, a face they were not yet ready to remember. Or perhaps it was something simpler, a chore postponed until tomorrow that never arrived. But then others followed suit, avoiding the space for reasons they never questioned. Until eventually, the room became something more in its absence than it ever was in its use. The phrase, "no lock had truly barred entry," becomes a kind of quiet indictment, a reminder that what keeps us out is often not steel or command, but routine, reluctance, and reverence. It's not that we're forbidden, only that we forget to consider ourselves welcome. We allow the shape of old habits to stand in for rules, and we behave accordingly. Even now, if you were to stand before the door, you might hesitate, not out of fear, but out of deference, the way one does before stepping into a long-forgotten church or onto the stage of an empty theater. You would not want to break something invisible. You would not want to startle the hush. But the truth is, Nothing would resist you. The knob would turn beneath your hand with a slight give, the kind that makes you wonder whether it had been used just yesterday or not at all for decades. The air would greet you, not musty or stale, but still, as if it had been waiting patiently without counting the hours. Inside, nothing dramatic would occur. Nothing would leap to life. You would not be watched or judged. The room would simply allow your presence, the way a field allows a shadow to pass. And yet, you would feel changed, wouldn't you? Even if you said nothing. Even if you touched nothing. Even if you turned and left after only a minute. You would carry the knowledge that the barrier was never real, that you could always have stepped through, that you had lived beside a threshold all this time, mistaking it for a wall. There's a certain quiet weight in that realization, one that does not accuse but lingers gently. It makes you wonder how many other doors remain untried. How many memories remain sleeping, not because they are dangerous, but because they are forgotten. How many thoughts have you walked past without daring to revisit, thinking them sealed when they were only unattended? There are rooms in the mind, too, that are like this. Places where old conversations sit in the stillness, half-finished. Places where feelings have gone to rest, not buried, just laid down like coats over chairs. We think we've locked these away, but there is no lock, only the idea of one. Sometimes we return to these inner rooms without knowing. A certain smell, a chord in a song, the color of a stranger's coat, and suddenly, we are there, standing in a space we haven't named in years. The moment feels familiar and strange, like entering a dream you didn't know was still with you. You feel disoriented not because you don't belong, but because you thought you had lost the way. But you hadn't. You just hadn't tried. No lock had truly barred entry. It's a phrase that belongs to places like these, physical or emotional. Not grand, not haunted, not tragic. Just paused, just waiting. There is no urgency in the invitation, no pressure to stay or search or speak aloud. You are simply allowed, and sometimes that's all a space needs, to be remembered again, if only for a moment. If you sat inside the room for long enough, the details would begin to rise to the surface. Not all at once, but gradually, like the way light slowly defines shapes in a dim room. You'd notice the slight tilt of the floorboards, the way one corner of the rug curls in on itself. You'd see how the chair was pushed back at an angle, as if someone had stood quickly and never returned. You'd find yourself wondering whether the person meant to come back or not, and whether it mattered. Eventually, you might reach for something. A book, perhaps, a piece of cloth, a letter was left on the desk. It would not feel like trespassing. It would feel like touching your own handwriting after forgetting what it looked like. And you would not be sure what to do with the feeling. Most people, after a while, would stand again, not in discomfort, but in completion. There is something satisfying about having entered a space you once avoided, even if you do nothing inside it, even if you never return. The fact of entering is its own quiet revolution. It says, this too was always here, and I too still know how to cross a threshold. When you close the door behind you, gently without force, you might feel a brief uncertainty. It's not about what you saw, but about what it means now that you've seen it. You may wonder if others will notice, if the dust will shift, if the silence inside has changed its pitch, just slightly. But you won't stay to listen. You'll return to the hallway, and the door will look the same, but not to you. And that is the truth of so many things. They remain unentered not because they are sealed, but because they are overlooked, untried, and unimagined. And in this way, we surround ourselves with quiet rooms, rooms of thought, rooms of memory, rooms of presence. And sometimes all it takes is a moment of pause, a willingness to turn the knob, and the lock that was never there will no longer feel like a question. No one guards these spaces. No sign forbids. No spellbinds. Only time. Only choice. And now you know. The lock was never real. The door was always yours to open. And that is all it ever was. The keys were always there, just not noticed. That was the quiet truth. Simple, undramatic, and entirely consistent with how most truths behave. They didn't appear suddenly. They didn't emerge from a hidden compartment or fall from a crack in the ceiling. They had been resting in plain sight, not concealed but not announced either. They were not lost. They were merely not seen. The keys had no shine to catch the eye. They didn't glint in the sunlight or make themselves known by noise. They had not made a sound in years. No clinking against wood, no rustle in a pocket, no echo against a door. Silence had settled over them like a layer of dust, not heavy, not accusatory, just present. A stillness so complete that even the metal had begun to seem like part of the shelf they lay upon, as though the brass had absorbed enough quiet to become furniture itself. They weren't on a hook or in a dish or hung with a ribbon, just resting. At the far edge of the mantel, tucked behind a dried bouquet and an old photograph that had curled at the edges. The bouquet, once lavender and thyme, had faded into brittle outlines of scent. The photo, an image of someone not quite remembered, leaned against the wall at the perfect angle to block casual glances. Behind them both, the keys waited. Not with intent, not with urgency, only with time. They hadn't been needed in a long while, at least not in the way most people think of keys, as tools to open, to grant access, to let one in or out. These were not the keys to anything dramatic. Not a treasure chest, not a locked diary, not a forbidden room, just keys. Perhaps to a drawer, perhaps to a cupboard whose lock had broken so long ago no one remembered it ever functioning. They were too small to belong to doors and too old to match anything modern. But they were there. They had always been there. It's a strange thing, the way attention works. How something can be right there, within reach, within view, and still be missed entirely. The mind filters what it believes is unimportant. It shapes the room around what it expects. You pass a shelf every day, see a shape, a color, a blur of familiar corners, and assume it is what it was yesterday. But the truth is, you never really saw it. You saw your idea of it. And so the keys remained, seen but unseen. Someone had placed them there, long ago. That much was certain. Not dropped, not discarded. Placed. The ring of them sat just so, not overlapping the edge, not at risk of falling. Balanced, as if arranged with care, or perhaps out of habit. Perhaps their last user had meant to return to them shortly, had planned to retrieve them after boiling the kettle, after answering a knock, after the brief distraction of a thought, and then simply never did, and time did what it always does. It moved forward, and the keys became still. They aged differently from the other things in the room. While paper yellowed and wood cracked and cloth softened into threads, the keys only dulled. Their sheen became matte, their outlines smoothed by 1,000 subtle shadows. But they endured. Metal does, especially when it is no longer being used. They kept their shape, their weight, their presence, light enough to be forgotten, heavy enough to be remembered. There was a time, perhaps, when they were kept in a pocket, when fingers curled around them absently during a walk through the garden, when their small shape offered comfort in a world of larger worries, when they were turned in a lock at dusk, or held in a hand during the final sweep of a room before sleep. They had been used once. That was certain. Keys are not born irrelevant. They only become so when the things they open are either opened forever or no longer needed. And so they waited. Without waiting. They were not conscious of being overlooked. They did not long for recognition, but they were there, always. They did not vanish. They did not ask. They simply were. When they were noticed, finally, it wasn't with surprise. It was with that quiet sensation of something fitting into a memory already half-formed, like recalling a word just as someone else speaks it. There was no exclamation, no drama, just the soft pause of someone stopping in mid-step, tilting their head and whispering, "Oh, those." It was the light that revealed them that day. A slant of pale winter sun filtered through the drawn curtains at just the right hour. The bouquet, shifted slightly by a breeze from the cracked window, bent just enough to uncover the edge of brass. A single curved shape caught the light, not a shine, but a suggestion, and that was enough. The eye, finally, caught the difference. The mind, for once, did not override the moment with familiarity. The keys were seen, and suddenly, everything rearranged itself. Not the room, but the memory of the room. The mind, now alerted, began to reconstruct. Yes, it thought. Yes, I've seen those before. A vague recollection of a conversation. A voice once said, "Leave them there. I'll come back for them later." A later that never arrived. Or perhaps it did, but the keys were no longer needed by then. And now they were just keys, and yet not just. Because now they meant something more than they ever had when they were useful. Now they were a thread to something past. Not a specific memory, not a date, but a feeling. The knowledge that someone once cared enough to place them gently. That someone once used them, trusted them, carried them. What they opened no longer mattered. In truth, it never had. What mattered was their presence, their persistence, their quiet refusal to disappear. They were a symbol, but not of access, of attention, of how many small things are with us, around us, part of us, even when we stop noticing them. The keys were a reminder that not everything lost is gone. Some things are merely waiting for us to see them again. They were cool to the touch when finally picked up. Not cold, just cool. The kind of cool that metal becomes when it hasn't been held in a long while. The weight of them was more than physical. It wasn't heavy, but it brought something down into the body, a grounding, a subtle gravity of recognition. Turning them over in the hand was a slow act. One didn't feel the need to rush. There was no door waiting, no urgency pressing, just the sensation of returning to something once known, now quiet, like reading a sentence you forgot you wrote, or finding a pressed flower in a book you hadn't opened since spring. The bouquet beside them remained undisturbed, except for that one final tilt. The photograph, its subject now even less distinct, stayed leaning against the wall. But everything else had changed, not physically, but perceptually. Now that the keys were seen, the room felt fuller, more complete, as if one quiet question had been answered. Not dramatically, not loudly, just gently. There was no decision made about what to do with them. They weren't pocketed or returned to use. They were simply moved slightly forward toward the front of the shelf, not to be seen by everyone, but to be acknowledged now. They had been noticed. That was enough. And once seen, they were never unseen again. The eyes, now trained to their presence, would always find them again. The mind, once reminded, would always remember where they lay. The keys, no longer hidden in plain sight, became part of the room's quiet chorus of memory. One more note in the long, slow hum of what had been kept. There are always keys like this, not always made of brass or looped in a ring, but small, waiting things, ideas, memories, tools, names. They rest in corners, behind habits, under the layers of days and months and years, not missing, just unseen. They wait for us to slow down enough to see them again, and when we do, they do not leap up or announce themselves. They simply offer what they always had, a presence, a possibility, a direction. The keys had always been there, just not noticed, until they were. Someone had meant to return. There was no announcement of this intention, no dramatic departure or promise carved into a doorframe. Yet the room remembered. It always had. It is remembered in the way a chair retains the impression of a body long after the person stands. In the way a door, slightly ajar, suggests not absence, but a pause. Someone had meant to come back. You could feel it in the objects that had not been put away, in the stillness that held its breath, rather than exhaling all the way. The space waited, not expectantly, not anxiously, but with a quiet readiness, like a hand resting palm up in case it should be held again. On the table by the window, a pair of spectacles lay folded, as if set down only for a moment. The kind of placement that doesn't to say, "I mem done," but rather, just a moment. The arms were not tucked in carefully, nor flung carelessly. They rested with a familiarity born of routine. Their position suggested habit. Perhaps someone always removed them to rub their eyes, to lean back in the chair, to watch the light shift across the wall. And beside them, a book lay open, spine gently curved, a ribbon marker resting in the middle, caught between two pages that now faced no reader. There was dust on the book now, only the finest layer, not enough to say it had been forgotten, only enough to say that it had waited. Perhaps someone had left in the middle of a chapter, meaning to finish it later, meaning to come back when the room was quieter, or when the kettle had finished boiling. But the kettle remained cold. No sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Still, the page did not turn without them. There was a coat, too, draped over the back of a wooden chair near the door. It had not been hung neatly, nor discarded with urgency. The sleeves hung down evenly. The collar rested slightly off-kilter, as though the coat had been shrugged off while the person still thought of something else, something unfinished, something not yet left behind. The fabric bore the softness of wear and the lingering curve of a person who had not yet said goodbye. Not really. A pair of shoes stood beneath the bench, positioned side by side, their tips pointed outward, as if already ready to be stepped into. Not the kind of shoes you forget, the kind you plan to return to. Their soles, if you looked closely, still bore the imprint of the last path taken. Mud that had dried into soft outlines, the tread of memory. They stood like punctuation marks waiting for a sentence to resume. The calendar on the wall had stopped being turned, not in neglect, but in pause. A date still circled faintly in pencil. It was not today's date, nor tomorrow's. It had long passed, but it meant something. A reminder of an intention, a lunch perhaps, a call, a task half done. Below it, a list had been written and then scratched out halfway. The rest remained blank, the kind of blank that waits rather than concludes. The clock still worked. It ticked gently, its hands moving through hours no longer noticed. But the time it told had stopped feeling urgent long ago. It marked not the present, but the echo of presence. A small brass timepiece on the mantel had long since wound down, but no one had bothered to rewind it. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of hope, because someone had meant to return. There was evidence in the kitchen, too. A mug is placed in the sink, not washed, but not forgotten. The kind of placement that suggests, "I'll be right back." The water had dried inside it, and yet there was something about its tilt, the way it leaned slightly on its side, that felt more temporary than abandoned. On the windowsill above the sink, a sprig of rosemary sat in a jar of water. Its leaves were slightly wilted, as though it had waited too long for the hand that once clipped it. But it had been clipped. It had been chosen. That mattered. A dish towel hung slightly askew from the oven handle, faded from years of use, yet recently folded. It still held a crease. The kind of soft crease that doesn't say fresh, but says familiar, as though someone had laid it there as part of a rhythm, a practice done so many times before that it barely needed thinking. A rhythm interrupted, not broken. The bed had been made. but not carefully, not like a bed no one would return to. It had the look of sheets smoothed by a single hand, of pillows fluffed not for decoration but for comfort. A corner of the quilt was turned down, just slightly, as though someone had risen from it recently, as though someone might return to it before the night was done. Even the curtains had been drawn halfway, not for show, but to let the light in just enough, to see perhaps the garden outside, where a watering can still leaned beside the steps, its spout pointed at the ground, and a little rust had gathered along the bottom. It hadn't been used in some time, but it had not been discarded either. It waited, like everything else. There was a jacket draped over the stair banister, a book of stamps on the desk, only one missing, a half-written letter, folded but not sealed, its last line ending mid-thought, a scarf resting atop a cabinet, one end dipped just enough to graze the floor. It was not the objects themselves that held weight, it was the way they had been left, not discarded, not abandoned, but paused, touched last by someone who meant to touch them again. Sometimes the air itself seemed to hold that memory. In the late hours, when the world outside grew quiet and the house settled into its night breath, the sense of almost return thickened. It hung in the corners, in the quiet hum of the walls, in the faintest scent of something once cooked. The silence did not feel empty. It felt paused, like a story caught between lines. One could imagine that if the door were to open quietly without fanfare, the house would exhale, not in surprise but in relief, as if every grain of dust, every worn surface had been holding its breath for just that sound, not for apology, not for explanation, just return. Just the warmth of footsteps again, the rustle of fabric through a doorway, the soft clatter of keys returned to their dish. And perhaps someone did return. Perhaps not often. Perhaps only once, and briefly. Perhaps they stood in the doorway and looked, but did not step inside. Perhaps they touched the edge of the chair, ran a hand along the wall, let their fingers hover over the book they once left open. Perhaps they whispered something no one else heard. Perhaps they smiled, or cried, or neither. Perhaps that moment was enough to stir the dust just slightly, to send a ripple through the stillness. Or perhaps they never returned at all, not with their body at least, but in intention, they were always just around the corner. Every item left behind held not their absence but their promise. Not what was missing, but what was meant to continue. And that promise stayed. It didn't age, it didn't fade. It became the room's atmosphere, its breath, its heartbeat. In this house, this quiet pocket of stillness, the return did not need to happen to be real. The meaning lay in the intention. In the mug, placed gently in the sink. In the coat, still waiting on the chair. In the book, left open to a page whose meaning was known to one pair of eyes only. Someone had meant to return. And so, the house waited, not empty, but full of that quiet, persistent hope. Not desperate, not mournful, just still, just listening. Outside, the seasons turned. Trees shed and regrew their leaves. Snow came and melted. Flowers pushed through the earth, bloomed and wilted again. The world moved. But inside, this space continued to hold, to remember, to honor the shape of someone who had once moved through it with the easy familiarity of belonging, who had once lit the lamp, opened the curtains, and smoothed the bed. Someone who hadn't said goodbye, only perhaps later. And so, even now, when the light shifts across the floor and dust dances in the slant of late afternoon, the room does not grow lonelier. It grows quieter, more attuned, more patient, because someone had meant to return. There are places where the door swings on its hinge, not out of neglect, but out of invitation, a silent gesture that something remains unfinished. Doors were not the only things left open, is not merely a statement about physical spaces. but about the quiet ways in which people leave behind more than objects. The room might have been abandoned, yes, but abandonment is rarely complete. Even in the absence, something lingers. Thoughts half-formed, words left unsaid, gestures paused mid-motion and never resumed. The door may be ajar, but so too is the memory, the emotion, the story that never quite found its final page. What we leave behind is rarely just material. Cupboards might remain closed, drawers may stay untouched, and yet there are other kinds of openings. Emotional, invisible, lingering like a draft in a warm room. The open door becomes a metaphor, but it is not the only one. Windows may be shut, but longing seeps through the glass. Letters may remain unwritten, but their words live in the silence between other things. An open door is only the beginning of a story about what was left unresolved. To leave a door open is to admit, perhaps unconsciously, that return was once possible, or at least hoped for. No one leaves a door open without some quiet understanding that something might need to pass through again. A breeze, a shadow, a memory, a person. And yet, not all returns are physical. Some come in the shape of thoughts long avoided, others in the scent of something familiar. Still others are in the way that light hits a certain corner of the wall. The door stays open, yes. But more than that, so does the moment. We often close doors to end things, to contain, or to distance. But when a door is left open, something lingers. It's an act without finality. It suggests that the story, whatever it was, isn't over. And perhaps more importantly, that we aren't entirely ready for it to be. There is comfort in closure, but there is also tenderness in what remains unresolved. To leave something open is to give it space to breathe, to expand without conclusion, to echo. In these kinds of rooms, where dust has started to settle in quiet layers across the surfaces and the walls remember things even when no one else does, the open door is not a hazard or an oversight. It is an offering, a continuation of presence even in absence, a soft, nearly imperceptible way of saying, I was here, and perhaps I still am in some way. The room does not ask for answers, the house does not demand explanation, but the open door says more than any words ever could. And what else was left open then? Not just the physical passageways, but the conversations that were never finished, the emotions that were never resolved, the intentions that never took shape. Some promises were made in the silence between sentences, goodbyes that were never spoken aloud because they hurt too much to pronounce, and hope, yes, that too, left hovering like dust caught in the afternoon sun. These too remain open, not out of forgetfulness, but out of reverence for what couldn't be forced into an ending. Sometimes the open things are small, an unfinished note, a drawer left half open, a photograph that's not quite tucked away. These are not messes. They are echoes. They are the shapes memory takes when it's not quite ready to retreat. When you notice them, you feel the pull of what was once alive, still pulsing faintly in the background. The past hasn't gone. It's simply waiting just beyond the threshold, respectful of your pace, but unwilling to disappear entirely. There is also the matter of the heart. The way we leave it open, even when we pretend it's closed. The way we think we've shut ourselves off to feeling, only to be caught unaware by a scent, a sound, a color we didn't expect. Our inner doors are more fragile than we realize and more generous. Even when we vow not to feel again, some part of us keeps the door open, just in case. Just in case something soft comes through instead of pain. Just in case there is still something left worth welcoming. Doors are not the only things that let the outside in. Some looks invitee without intention. Pauses in conversations that stretch into invitations for truth. A letter never sent but always drafted. A dream that returns not because you summoned it, but because some part of you still wonders. All of these are open things. All of these are the quiet, unspoken doorways between what happened and what could have happened, between presence and distance, between memory and the now. The open door, over time, becomes a character of its own. It creaks not out of age alone, but out of participation. It is a witness. It frames each sunset from the same angle. It lets in the evening chill, yes, but it also holds the heat of all the summers that came before. It has watched people walk away and return. It has held silence, muffled laughter, and carried secrets in the space between its frame and the hallway beyond. And in its openness, it says, I remain, I watch, I wait. Some may ask, why didn't they close it? But those who have lived with unresolved endings know the answer. Because sometimes closing the door makes the loss feel final. Sometimes it hurts more to shut something away than to leave it half-welcomed. To keep it open is to allow breath, to admit vulnerability, to confess without speaking that there are still things we carry, not because we must, but because letting go isn't always a clean gesture. Sometimes it's gradual. Sometimes it never fully completes. In quiet places, where memory speaks louder than voices and time moves like breath through an old curtain, these openings become maps. A door left ajar, a notebook with the last few pages blank, a cup on the table, as if someone meant to return. They form the topography of waiting. Not desperate waiting, but gentle, the kind that understands some arrivals never come, and yet still makes room for them anyway, just in case. And perhaps that is what makes it tender, the act of not finishing, of not forcing an ending where one doesn't belong. The open door is not an error. It is the softest refusal to say goodbye. And by doing so, it becomes an embrace. A place where what was can rest without being pushed out. A space where time doesn't demand closure, and where presence doesn't require being seen. Even in places we no longer live, parts of us remain. The room remembers your footsteps, even if you've forgotten them. The floor still tilts ever so slightly from where you always stood. The curtain still folds along the same creases you used to pull. And the door, left open, does not mind how long you've been gone. It is still open for you, or for what you left behind, or for no one at all, simply for the principle of openness itself. Because what is openness, if not an act of hope? A doorway is an architecture of trust, that something might arrive, that something might return. And when we leave those spaces open, we are not saying what we expect. We are saying we allow, and that difference is subtle but profound. Expectation clings, but allowance, that floats. It does not grasp or demand. It invites gently. So the door stays open, not dramatically, not with a purpose stamped on it, just slightly, humbly ajar, letting in whatever light there is, letting out whatever silence needs to go. There is no rush, no need for declarations. The open door is a conversation with stillness, a promise without a timeline, a kindness to what might never come, but is welcome all the same. In this way, doors become poetry, not for their hinges or their wood or their weight, but for what they represent when they are not fully closed. An unfinished sentence, a story still unfolding, a breath held in the middle of a thought. To leave a door open is to honor the presence of possibility. And in doing so, we also honor the truth that some things, some people, some memories never fully leave. They just drift into the hallway, waiting for the right time to return, or for someone to follow. And in that stillness, there is peace. Not the loud kind, but the kind that hums quietly behind everything else. The kind of peace that comes not from knowing how the story ends, but from being okay with not knowing. A peace that allows things to remain open, not because they must, but because some stories, some connections, are too large to fit inside a closed door, their edges curled with time. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, quietly, like the slow gesture of someone tucking their hands into their sleeves on a cold day. The pages began to shift inward, drawing closer to themselves as the years passed. It wasn't something anyone noticed right away. You don't see the first curl. You see it only after it has already begun, long after time has worked its quiet way through every fiber. The paper had once been crisp, clean, flat, perhaps even proud in its newness. Maybe it had been pressed beneath the weight of a palm or the sweep of a writing hand. Or maybe it had been stacked neatly, aligned with corners sharp and precise. It had purpose then. A list, a letter, a draft, a note passed quietly across a desk. But that was long ago. Time doesn't take paper with violence. It simply waits. It visits softly, regularly, asking nothing, offering nothing, until the paper begins to bend beneath its presence. It starts at the corners first, of course, where air lingers and hands once held. The edges rise, then curve, then fold themselves gently inward, like petals at dusk. Some pages curled into themselves like secrets. Others flared slightly outward, as if stretching to remember the shape they once held. The curling wasn't symmetrical, and it didn't need to be. Some edges rose higher than others, some folded under. It gave each sheet the soft impression of having its own breath, its own posture, and its own quiet opinion on the years that had passed. These weren't dramatic curls. Nothing about them cried out for attention. They were the sort of changes you notice only in silence, only when everything else has gone still and the light falls at just the right angle. No two pages curled quite the same. Some bowed like the faintest wave. Others tightened at the tip like a leaf after rain. In some places, the pages began to buckle faintly in the center, as if tired from holding themselves upright for so long. The margins turned ghostly, faded to soft cream or yellow, and the ink, where there was any, had softened with age. Words that once stood with clarity now blurred into themselves, smudged not by touch, but by patience. It wasn't only pages. Fabric does the same. The hem of a forgotten curtain, the cuff of a shirt left folded in a drawer, a napkin tucked behind a cupboard door, each finds its way into curl and crease. Time favors curves over lines. It doesn't erase sharpness, it rounds it. So too did the edges of photographs bend. Black and white or faded color, matte or glossy, the borders lifted from their frames and curled ever so slightly toward the wall behind them. A slow retreat, a silent folding into memory. The curling didn't mean damage, it meant persistence, a kind of quiet survival. These things had not been thrown away. They had not been torn, not lost to fire or water or disregard. They had stayed, tucked in boxes, pinned to boards, resting in drawers, waiting. It was in this waiting that the curling began, not from being touched too much, but from not being touched at all, from the space between glances, between uses, from air, from dust, from stillness. Sometimes you could find an entire stack of papers, forgotten on a shelf or in a drawer left slightly ajar. And every page in that stack would be just a little more curled than the one below it. The topmost one would rise at the corners like a question left unanswered. The next might sink slightly, bowed with the memory of pressure once placed upon it. And somewhere in the middle, one would stay almost perfectly flat, still clinging to the idea of being needed again. The curling edges carried no urgency. They did not suggest that someone should come along and flatten them, press them, or restore them. They were not waiting to be made new. They had grown into their shape slowly and naturally, as vines find their way around stone, as waves wear down the sharpness of cliffs. There was a kind of grace in their surrender, a quiet, yielding beauty. They were no longer trying to be what they were. They had settled into what they had become. You could run a fingertip lightly along the edge of one of these pages and feel the slight rise, the softness of time's work. Not brittle, not rough, just gently textured. Paper that had curled over decades did not resist touch. It yielded, pliant and kind, as though it recognized being seen again. But even when touched, it did not uncurl. It held its shape, quietly proud of the form it had been allowed to take in peace. In some places, whole books had bent this way. Covers pulling away from spines, pages lifting like breath caught in the act of exhaling. Not neglected, not abused, just present long enough to change. A book resting closed for years begins to reshape itself. The tension in the binding loosens. The outer corners pull away. The middle settles, like a sigh that has been held too long and finally let go. Photographs curled too. The ones pinned to corkboards with dull thumbtacks or pressed into albums that had not been opened in a decade. Their images still held, the faces, the places, the half-remembered moments, but their borders began to arch upward, lifting from the paper as if trying to rise off the page. Not escape, not fly, just move slightly. A hint of motion where there had been none. As if even memories require the smallest shift to stay alive. There was never a moment when this curling started. No single day when the edges lifted. Time does not work with dates, not here. It does not announce its projects. It simply enters, subtle and sure, and continues. You notice only when the change has fully arrived, when the straightness you assumed would last forever is no longer there. And by then the curve feels natural, inevitable even. As though the object had always wanted to be this way, and time merely helped it remember how. Even in places meant to resist time, libraries, archives, carefully curated spaces, you can find curled edges. The most meticulously preserved page still carries a softness, a slight yielding at its margin. It's never quite perfect, nor should it be. Perfection resists memory, curling, bending, softening. These are the ways objects make peace with age. They stop standing rigidly and begin to live quietly. If you look closely enough at any space where people once lived, truly lived, with habits and objects and unspoken routines, you will find the curling. At the corners of wallpaper, in the folded edge of a dish towel, in the spine of a notebook left half full. It is a language of time, a script written not in ink but in air, waiting, in wait. And the beauty of these curled edges is that they tell a story without needing to be told. They do not shout. They do not ask for interpretation. They simply are. A testimony not to action, but to duration, to being kept, to being there. Sometimes a gust of wind will flutter these pages, just a little, enough to rustle the curls, to remind them of movement. They do not flatten. They lift, they wave, and then they return to rest. Wind cannot undo what time has shaped gently. The curl once earned remains. And it is, in the end, a kind of quiet miracle. That so many things, so ordinary, so easily dismissed, can bear such eloquent signs of having simply lasted. That in a world so fond of erasure and speed, there still exist corners that rise with age, that curl not in resistance, but in grace. They do not cling to what they were. They do not demand to be made new. They are not ruins. They are continuations. And so the edges curled with time, and the room accepted them. The shelves bore their soft shapes without protest. The drawers cradled them. The air moved around them. They were not hidden. They were not displayed. They were simply present. Still, that presence, that curling, was enough. The ink still spoke. Not in the way a voice might echo through a hallway, or a name might be called across a field. Its sound was quieter than that, too soft for the ear to truly catch. And yet it was there, in the way certain words refused to fade, the way the curves of a letter still bent gently toward the edge of the page. The ink did not shout. It simply remained, present, unrushed, unmoved by time, though time had clearly tried. It's strange how something so thin, so fine and delicate, can hold so much of someone. A stroke of ink, a comma where one need not be, a hesitation in the pressure of a pen. These were not simply marks. They were remnants of motion, of intention, the ghost of a hand that once knew what it was trying to say. The ink didn't merely record, it remembered. And in its quiet way, it still offered that memory to anyone patient enough to listen. The paper had yellowed with age, of course. The corners curled slightly, the fibers soft to the touch, as though they had absorbed decades of waiting. But the ink, oh, the ink, still held its shape. It had darkened in places and cracked a little in others, but the message hadn't dissolved. Not completely. Its voice was quieter now, like something whispered through a door just slightly ajar. But it was still speaking. To you. To anyone. To no one in particular. It did not matter whether the message was poetry or a list of groceries, whether it was an apology, a love letter, a journal entry, or a record of rainfall. The content was no longer the point. What mattered was the residue of presence, the visible proof that someone once pressed pen to page, that someone had once paused in the middle of a sentence to think, then continued on. The ink held that pause. The ink remembered what fingers had moved across the surface, what thoughts had narrowed into lines. It's possible the writer never expected the page to last. Perhaps it was written quickly, as one writes before sleep, eyes heavy, handwriting looser than usual. Perhaps it was written without the hope of being read again. And yet, here it was, years later, decades later, still here, still whispering. The ink spoke in loops and dots, in underlines and half-finished letters. It spoke through smudges and places where the pen had faltered. There were places where it seemed the writer had pressed too hard, as though emotion had leaked through the very motion of writing. And then, elsewhere, the lightest touch. Barely there, as though even putting thoughts into words had required care not to say too much. These were not just sentences. They were fragments of mood, texture, and thought. It takes time to notice the voice within old ink. At first glance, it looks like writing. At second glance, perhaps meaning. But if you sit long enough, if you let your breath settle and your eyes soften, you begin to hear something deeper. Not what the writer said, but how. And from that, something emerges that's harder to define but impossible to deny. Presence. The ink may no longer gleam wet on the surface, but it still remembers being fluid. It remembers the moment it was laid down, the press of the pen, and the angle of the hand. And it remembers, too, the silence after the writing was finished, the way the page rested, the way it waited. Perhaps the writer had no intention of leaving behind something sacred. Maybe they were only trying to empty their thoughts, to get something down before it dissolved. Maybe the ink was poured from routine, or from habit, or even out of a sense of duty. But whatever the reason, the result is the same. Something remains. And in that remaining, something speaks. You could run your finger along the lines and almost feel the shape of their day. Were they calm when they wrote this? Were they interrupted? Was it cold in the room, making the ink sluggish and the writing tight? Did they pause halfway through to sip something warm? The page holds no answers, only suggestions, and that is its power. The ink speaks, but not in declarations. It speaks in suggestion, in quiet hints, an invitation. There's a reverence in reading something old, not because it is old, but because it survived. It continued to exist while everything around it changed. It weathered the years, the hands that moved it from place to place, and the boxes that held it without notice. And still it speaks. It may be humble, but it has outlasted so much. The furniture may be gone, the voice may be gone, but the ink remains. Its shape is a kind of persistence. And isn't that what we all hope for in some small way? That something of us lingers? That our thoughts do not dissolve entirely? That some part of our day, our moment, our intention might remain for someone else to find? Not for glory or meaning, but simply to remind them that someone once stood where they now stand? The ink did not demand your attention. It waited. And when you finally looked, it did not rush to explain itself. It simply allowed you to trace it, letter by letter, as if retracing the outline of a memory that did not begin with you but was now somehow yours. You could hear it not as a sound, but as a presence. Not as instruction, but as echo. The sentence may not be profound. It may even be incomplete. A list interrupted, a thought left dangling, but still, it speaks. And the silence around it does not diminish its voice. It amplifies it, like a note sustained in a quiet room. You begin to notice what's not written, the space between lines, the margin where the pen hovered but did not write, the blank area beneath the last word where the ink ran out or the moment ended. These absences are not empty. They too say something. They say, this was the edge of the thought. This was where the writer stopped. This was where the paper kept listening, even when the words had gone. You might fold the paper carefully and place it back where you found it, not because you finished reading, but because the reading has settled. The message has landed. And now the ink is still again, still present, still speaking, but no longer needing to be heard. Its voice remains in your memory now, humming faintly in the quiet place where old things are held. And as you move away, you may wonder, how many other places hold voices like this? How many slips of paper are in the drawers? How many labels on forgotten boxes? How many names are written in the backs of books, in the corners of photographs, and on the undersides of things? All these fragments, silent, waiting, intact. All these messages are still speaking, even if no one is listening. Perhaps the ink never needed to be read aloud. Perhaps it never wanted to be. Perhaps its power was always in its stillness, the quiet confidence of staying, the way it outlasted the urgency that first created it. The ink no longer needs to explain itself. It only needs to be. And in this way, the ink becomes a kind of presence, not of the writer alone, but of continuity itself. It is a symbol of what lingers, of what endures not because it is strong or loud, but because it is patient, because it is made of intention, however fleeting. The ink still spoke, not to declare, not to persuade, but to remind. That something once mattered, that a hand once moved, that moment once found its shape in lines across a page. And that might be enough. There was a drawer in the room that hadn't been opened in a very long time. It didn't lock, nor did it stick. It simply remained closed, as though it had politely excused itself from the need to be noticed. The dust atop it had formed an undisturbed layer, soft and matte like powdered ash, and no one had quite remembered when it last shifted. But tucked quietly within, beneath long-forgotten stationery and the faded edge of a ribbon that had once been red, there was a map. It was not a map anyone had drawn recently. The paper had yellowed at the corners and curled ever so slightly, as though it had grown tired of being flat. The ink had softened to a kind of ghost color, not entirely black, not quite gray. The lines were delicate and sure, drawn by a hand that had known what it was doing. Someone had once taken care with this. Someone had once believed it led somewhere worth finding. And so it had been kept, preserved, and then forgotten in that particular way things are forgotten when no one wants to admit they are. The place it charted was named in faded lettering near the bottom, an elegant cursive, too precise to be hurried. But the name didn't resonate anymore. Not as a destination. It wasn't a place you could point to now on any modern globe, nor trace with your finger on any current atlas. Roads had shifted. Borders had redrawn themselves without asking permission. Buildings had crumbled or been remade in unfamiliar shapes. If the place ever had walls or gates or voices, they had long since been quieted. The land might still exist in theory under new names and definitions, but the place as it was, what this map pointed toward, was gone. And yet the map remained. Maps are strange like that. They don't require the thing they describe to still be standing. They hold shape even when the reality they once traced has blurred, faded, or vanished. This map didn't protest its own obsolescence. It didn't beg to be used. It simply waited, folded in patient corners, lines and grids and notations quietly holding space for a journey no longer possible. It was not disappointed. It was not lost. It had simply outlived its destination. If you opened it slowly, and you had to, because the creases had become stiff with time, it would lay itself out with a soft exhale of old air. Paper that has been closed too long has a scent, something between dust and memory. This one smelled faintly of pencil lead, old wood, and the edge of a season not quite summer, not quite spring. It was the scent of possibility that had grown still. The markings were precise, hills rendered in gentle curves, rivers sketched with a steady hand, and the placement of paths and dotted trails that once must have guided someone with great care. In the margins were notes written in small, slanted handwriting. Abbreviations. No one used anymore. Distances measured in a system no longer taught. A few stains near the edges suggested it had been carried, maybe through rain, or under a leaking satchel, or beneath a sleeve that brushed against a campfire. Whoever had made it, or carried it, must have believed in the place, believed it could be found, that the coordinates led somewhere you could stand and breathe and say, "I am here," that you could follow the lines and arrive, that the place and the person holding the map were destined to meet. But now there was no arriving, only the quiet echo of intent. What happens to a map when the place it leads to disappears? It does not crumble. It does not tear itself apart in grief. It simply becomes something else. A record, a relic, a whisper from a time when direction felt possible. It shifts from instruction to memory, like a photograph of a door that no longer opens, or a letter sent to an address that no longer exists. The act of holding it becomes more about remembering than reaching. Still, there was something comforting in its presence, in the way it held form. The lines had not faded completely. The bends of the roads still curved with purpose. The compass rose in the upper corner still pointed north, unfaltering, even though that north might no longer bring you anywhere you meant to go. There is something steady about a map that doesn't know how to change, in a world that constantly does. Sometimes a person might look at the map not to go somewhere, but to be reminded that once they wanted to, that once their hands hovered above these lines with hope and uncertainty. Once they planned a journey. Whether they took it or not no longer mattered. The map had carried that possibility for them, and now it carried the echo. There's a kind of tenderness in forgotten things, not pity, not nostalgia, but the soft recognition of what they once held. The map didn't need to prove itself. It had already done its part. Its purpose had once been clear, and that clarity gave it dignity even now. There was no shame in becoming a keepsake. In the right light, the map almost shimmered. Not in a magical way, but in the simple way ink catches late afternoon sun through dusty glass. The kind of light that makes you pause. The kind that slows you down without asking. If you leaned close enough, you might see the subtle impressions left by the pen that had drawn it. Slight indentations in the paper. Pressure marks from someone who had pressed a little harder when tracing out a river or drawing a mountain range. These marks told you that someone had once believed in contours and paths, that someone had said, "This is the way," and meant it. And if you closed your eyes with the map still unfolded beside you, it might conjure faint sounds. Not voices, just a sense of motion. Leaves rustling beside a trail, water moving under an old bridge, the crunch of footsteps over packed dirt, the silence between towns, the pause before choosing a fork in the road. None of it happened now, but the map remembered how it could have. It is strange how something so still can carry so much motion. The lines didn't move, but they implied movement, the way sheet music implies music, even when no one is playing. The way a recipe implies taste, even if the dish is never made. The map's silence was not empty. It was suggestive. It hinted, gently, at where you could have gone. And even though the place no longer existed, not in the way the map described, it didn't feel tragic. It didn't feel like loss, just change. The way fog reshapes a landscape without erasing it. The way rivers redraw their own edges over centuries. The way people outgrow certain questions but remember the way it felt to ask them. The room where the map rested held it kindly. It did not treat it as debris. It let the map remain folded where it had always been. The drawer half open now, as if the map had exhaled just enough to be noticed. It was no longer trying to guide. It was simply being, like a breath that no longer needed to reach anywhere, just to exist and be acknowledged. If someone else were to find the map now, truly find it, not just glance, they might not recognize the name of the place it charted. They might frown, tilt their head, and wonder where it was meant to lead. They might search for it and find nothing. But if they stayed long enough, if they listened to the quiet weight of the paper in their hands, they might understand. This map doesn't guide your feet anymore. It guides your remembering. There's a kind of peace in that. In holding a map that isn't meant to lead you forward but gently back, to a version of yourself that once believed a destination could be found and that the way there could be drawn in ink. That belief is not useless now. It is simply resting. Even maps deserve rest, even the ones that no longer work, because they once carried a direction. They once gave you something to unfold, to follow, to hold on to, and now they give you a moment to pause, to remember that not all arrivals are physical, that sometimes the journey ends in stillness, and the stillness itself becomes the place. The map lies quietly now, half open in the light. It does not hurry, it does not expect, it simply remains, a map to a place that no longer exists. And yet somehow, it still feels like it leads somewhere. Somewhere you once knew. Somewhere you don't need to go again, but are glad it was real. If only once, if only in your hands. There are things in this world that hold memory without holding attention. Pages in a book once turned with care, once smoothed by fingertips eager to understand or to feel. Now resting untouched, their corners curling slightly with time, their weight familiar only to the shelf that bears them. When we say, no finger had traced their lines in years, we are not only speaking of books or pages or literal lines of ink. We are speaking of stories once alive in breath and now dormant in quiet. We are speaking of things that waited without impatience. Words that still remain exactly where they were left, carrying meanings that no one asks about anymore. Once, those lines may have been read aloud or silently whispered in the privacy of thought. A finger may have followed each curve of a letter, each crease in the page, as if to draw something deeper from them, understanding perhaps, or memory. That simple gesture, tracing the lines, is a form of communion. It is an intimacy, almost like breathing life into the ink again. But years have passed, and no finger has come to stir the dust, to press gently along those grooves of story. The book remains closed but not empty. It is full of waiting, and not just books, photographs too. The kind stored in boxes no longer opened. The images are still there unchanged, holding still the expressions of people who once filled up rooms, who once spoke and sang and worried and laughed. But no hand has lifted them in so long. No thumb has brushed the edge of a faded print. No eyes have lingered on a face now half remembered. And yet these lines, these details, remain, not in vain, but in stillness. There's a kind of reverence in neglect, not the careless kind, but the slow, aching kind that comes when the heart cannot quite bring itself to return. Some lines go untraced because they are too painful to touch. Others, because the world moved too fast and the time to pause simply vanished. And so these stories wait, pressed between the pages of a book or buried inside a drawer, or tucked behind a cabinet door. They do not complain. They do not vanish. They simply endure. The lines might belong to handwriting once known by heart, a letter signed in a familiar hand, a journal entry hastily scribbled on a quiet morning. The curve of each letter, the pressure of pen to page, was once as distinctive as a fingerprint. But time softens memory, even as it preserves the ink. The handwriting remains, but the hand is gone, and no one has followed those strokes in years. Still, the page waits. It is not only physical traces that go untouched. There are emotional lines, too. Patterns of thought, threads of affection, and questions once pondered are left hanging in midair. Entire inner landscapes, once mapped out carefully in someone's mind, are now folded in, silent. These, too, can go untraced. A life remembered only in fragments, its full shape no longer accessible. The details blur at the edges. The connections between events fray, and the person, the experience, the moment. It recedes, not entirely gone, but no longer touched. The stillness of things left untouched is not quite grief. It is quieter, softer. Like the hush that follows when someone stops speaking, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know words would no longer reach who they were meant for. It is the silence that settles over things when time has passed, and the world no longer turns its head to look in that direction. A silence filled not with absence, but with endurance. The lines remember, the page remembers, the object remembers, even if the finger does not return. Even if the person who once traced them no longer lives or no longer feels the same urge to remember. The lines hold fast to their meaning, even if no one retrieves it. They do not fade out of defiance. They do not beg to be known again. They simply exist, intact, entire, and still. And yet there is a tenderness in imagining that someone once did trace them, once held them close, once breathed into them meaning and presence. Someone once followed the words, or the image, or the thought, not with urgency, but with care. There was once warmth, once motion, once connection, and that memory, however distant, is not undone by time. It only lies dormant. Rooms hold these lines too. The grooves on a table where fingers tapped without thought. The edge of a bookshelf worn smooth by the same hand reaching, always reaching. The indent of a footstep in the carpet. These are lines of another kind, not made by pen or pencil, but by presence. They are the imprint of a person moving through a space often enough to alter it. And now that they are gone, the traces remain, visible only to the quiet observer. The floor creaks in the same place, but no one steps there. The handle is slightly loose, but no hand turns it. Still, the signs remain. To trace is to connect. It is to bring yourself into relationship with something that was made before you, or by you, or for you. It is a small gesture, just a fingertip on a line, but it binds time to presence. And when that connection is not renewed, something shifts. Not erasure, not disappearance, but a kind of waiting, a soft suspension, as if everything were holding its breath. There are many reasons why fingers stop tracing lines. Sometimes we forget. Sometimes the memories are too sharp. Sometimes we think we've moved on. Other times we don't know what we've left behind until years later, when we stumble across it by accident and realize just how long it has been untouched. And when we do, there is often a moment of pause, not out of guilt, but recognition. Something once part of us has remained behind, patiently. There is beauty in that patience, the way ink clings to paper across years, the way photographs hold light and shadow as if time never passed, the way wood darkens but does not forget the hands that shaped it. These things do not need us to be remembered. They simply are. And the fact that they remain untouched but unchanged is their quiet act of faith. And sometimes, even after all those years, the finger returns, almost without meaning to. It brushes across a page. It smooths a crease. It pauses, following the arc of a sentence once memorized, now unfamiliar. And something stirs. Not everything returns, not every feeling, not every memory, but enough does. Enough to feel the shape of the past again. Enough to remember that the lines, though untraced for years, never disappeared. That first touch after a long silence is not a grand moment. It is small. It is quiet. It is a fingertip and a line. It is a breath taken in the presence of memory. And the object, whatever it is, welcomes the contact without accusation. It does not ask why it was forgotten. It only offers itself again. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of it all, that what we leave behind continues to offer itself to us. Books do not close themselves. Photos do not hide. Pages do not seal shut. They remain open to return, to rediscovery, to renewal. They endure not in bitterness, but in hope. Not desperate hope, but the gentle kind, the kind that waits without demanding. In the end, no finger had traced their lines in years is not a sentence about loss. It is about possibility. It is about the quiet endurance of things once loved, once known. It is about the silent, steady presence of stories that continue to exist whether or not we read them. It is about how the world holds space for return without rushing us, and how sometimes the most generous thing something can do is remain. There is still time. There is always time, as long as the lines remain. Even if they are buried beneath dust, behind doors, under layers of daily forgetting. When the time is right, when the heart is soft again, the finger will find its way back. And when it does, the line will be there, unchanged, quiet, waiting to be known again.